Okay, sounds good.
Let me see if I can. Right, present full screen. All right, so healing your blood sugar using food as medicine to balance your diabetes and pre-diabetes. I'm actually going to turn my other speaker down real quick. All right, so a little bit about like the lay of the land and a little bit about this workshop if you haven't been in workshops before. So, like, of course, we're going to go over like why we're even here in the first place, why is it important, a little bit of the science and pathophysiology about like what diabetes even is. And for some people, this may feel like something that they already know. And for other folks, like, I mean, I had worked in hospitals with diabetics who had been diabetic for 20 years, and I would explain this stuff, and they're like, I had no idea. So, like, take what you need, leave what you don't, totally fine. And then we're going to be talking about like what's even happening when our like in our body when our blood sugar is going up and down and why it's important. And then probably the reason why most people are here is like how do we bring it back into balance? What are some foundational food as medicines, some lifestyle changes that we can do, some action steps to get our body back into healing, and then of course some herbal allies and other support that we can use to bring our body back into balance. So, why are we here, right? Like, what is the problem, anyways? And for me personally, I heard a statistic then was like diabetes in my lifetime from 1990s until like this year has doubled. And so when I start hearing things like that like a chronic illness is doubling, I'm like, what the heck is going on in our modern environment in our world? Um, that we're seeing numbers and things happen like that. So we're going to talk into that a little bit. And then, also working in the hospital, seeing a lot of new cases of like juvenile diabetes. So, like, not type 1, but like kiddos, 8, 9, 10-year old, getting diagnosed with this stuff. So, I feel like it warrants having the conversation because I believe like when we become the healers in our home, then we can pass that on to our family and to our friends and to our kids as well, right? So that like we can all live this life of vitality and wellness. But then just some other things, right? Like chronic illness is expensive. So the average cost of type 2 diabetes is 13,000 per year for individuals. And so I think this is important too, right? Like medications can be expensive, doctor's visits, insurance is expensive, right? If we have an episode where we are in the hospital or we have to miss out on work, right? Like that can be costly to us as well. So, like I said, when we bring our body back into balance, when we start to have this life of vitality, when we can bring down these chronic illnesses, like, right, like why are we here? It's like because I don't want to spend that much money. Like that stuff's expensive. Um, and then, of course, just like diabetes is one of the leading causes of death and disability worldwide, including kidney failure, neuropathy, which is nerve pain, vision loss, and then loss of limb and amputation. And so like, okay, like I don't want any more of that stuff long term, right? Um, and then I think this is just, like we talk about type 2 being a modern lifestyle disease, and they talk about, the reasons that we are seeing these spikes is because our lifestyle has shifted. But to me, that can kind of be like a silver lining. Like, yes, if it's a lifestyle disease and caused by partially by the way that we live as modern humans, then to me, I'm like, okay, so can we like unravel that and back it up and look towards some ways that our ancestors used to live um, in order to decrease and slow and put in remission things like type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. So, like, of course, right? Why are we here? To decrease personal costs, to prevent long term chronic health issues, like kidney disease, and like I said, like blindness or amputation, right? And then obviously, like, I think first and foremost, like, we just want to feel good in our bodies. We want to have that health. We want to have vitality. We want to run around with our kids. We don't want to be crashing, right? Like, that feels crummy. So whenever I come and I like for myself personally, if I come into a workshop, I'm always asking myself, like, why am I here? Like, and I might write that down in my journal, like, why is this important to me? And so if you have a journal nearby, that could be something just like, okay, like, why am I here? What do I want to get out of this? Like, why is it important to me to be here today? So I always in all of my workshops, um, I always will do like I will always start with a little bit of pathophysiology and a little bit of science because what I have found working in the hospital is that like a lot of folks, even if, like I said, even folks that have been diabetic for 15, 20 years, right? When you start to break it down, like what's actually happening in the body, a lot of people are like, oh, snap, look, I had no idea. And so I think when we understand what's going on underneath the hood, and then when we go to make changes, we feel like we have some of the tools and we feel like we can make the action steps to make changes because we're like, okay, like I know what's going on. So you don't have to remember everything in here. Like the names don't really make sense. Like I said, like you'll get the recording. I don't want you to come out of here and be like, I need to be like a scientist to remember these names. No, it's just understanding some of the big concepts. You can come back and re-listen to it, take what you need, leave what you don't. So starting from the absolute top, right? Like we talk about glucose in diabetes, but like where does glucose even come from? Like what does that even mean, right? And so from the top, right, glucose comes from carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, when plants photosynthesize, so anything that photosynthesizes, when it mixes with the sun and water and carbon dioxide, this like alchemical magical process happens and it makes carbohydrates. It is the way of plants storing energy that they may need for later use. So whether it's during the growth cycle or if they have to repair something, it is like the plant's way of storing energy. So first and foremost, like where do carbs come from? They come from plant material, right? So anywhere that the plant has stored it. So if it's underground in a carrot and potatoes and sugar cane and fruit and nuts and seeds, right? Like in wheat, anything that grows has carbohydrates as a storage form. And I think what's cool about that, that storage form, when we consume it, like we eat those carbohydrates, we eat those plants, nuts, seeds, berries, whatever, we eat that stored energy, we chew it up, and that kind of becomes energy for our cells. And so what I mean by that is carbs, also sometimes called starch. Um, we chew up that food, we swallow it, it comes to our small intestine. And when it gets in our small intestine, our body will start to break up those chains of glucose. So, what carbohydrates are just long chains of glucose. And another way that I like to explain this to people is if you have kids who have like made a stack of Legos, that whole Lego stack is called a carbohydrate. But the individual Lego, one by one, that's the glucose molecule. And so, like I said, when it comes down into our small intestine, we will break them off one by one. We have those individual glucoses, and now those glucoses can come into our bloodstream. They cross through the small intestine, they can come into our bloodstream. That's why it's called blood glucose. Um, and when it comes into our bloodstream, it will travel around and it will go to cells, and glucose's whole job is to be like cellular energy. And so like at the core of it, like I feel like I just have to like nip in the butt. People are like, carbs are bad, glucose is bad. And I'm like, no, right? Because our body needs glucose for energy. And we need carbohydrates. And I'm like, carbs aren't bad, right? Like that stuff was divinely given to us. Like fruits and veggies, like that's not bad stuff, right? Like that was created by nature, like I said, by divine, by creator for a reason. For a reason, we have been eating that food from the beginning of the time. So like at its core, carbs aren't bad and glucose isn't a bad thing. Um, so our cells use this glucose as energy. Um, right? We talk about the brain uses it for brain function. And when it's low, you might feel like you have brain fog, or you might feel like you've got poor memory or like cloudy thinking. So when our glucose is imbalanced, sometimes we can have some brain symptoms. It's because our brain uses that as a source of fuel. And then our muscles use glucose. So like every time we run or every time we're like lifting, moving our body, right? Our muscles have to have fuel and have to have energy to do that. And that comes from glucose. So how does glucose like get into the cell, right? So it's in the blood and then it's like traveling through the blood and it comes to a cell and it has to get in somehow. And this is where I'm sure y'all have heard of this, insulin, right? So when glucose in our blood gets like above a certain number, the pancreas in the body, and that's an organ that sits like underneath the stomach area, but the pancreas will sense like, oh, like they just had a meal, her blood sugar is kind of high. We need to release insulin because what insulin does is insulin will come to the cell and it will lock on to the cell like this lock and key mechanism. And when insulin locks on, it lets glucose come into the cell. So glucose can do what it does, right? So it can be cell fuel, cell energy, almost like gas for the cell. That is insulin's, like that's insulin's job, is allowing glucose to even come into the cell. And at its core and at its base, what the body is always trying to do is to keep our glucose, our blood glucose, within this like nice balanced middle ground kind of level. I like to say it's like the Goldilocks effect, right? So we don't want to be too low, because we see when we get really low, right? Like that's when people, like I said, like foggy thinking, can't think straight, potentially even coma when we get really, really low. Like we have to have glucose for cell fuel. And we don't want it to get too high either. We want this just right effect in the middle, this Goldilocks effect. And that's why the body's always sensing, like, how much do we have? Let's get it into the cells, to keep it nice and balanced and just right. So when does glucose then, right? Like if it's not inherently bad and we need it for cellular fuel, when does glucose become a problem? And what is insulin resistance? And so we'll come back to this slide another time, but I like to think of insulin resistance as, right, so like insulin should come to the cell. It should be that like lock and key. And it's like, yes, glucose, come on in. And you can kind of see that on the left-hand side, like the glucose is coming into the cell to do its job, to be cellular energy. Yay, that's what it's supposed to be doing there for. We can see on the right-hand side that like insulin, if you can kind of see from this picture, it's like not really matching up correctly. Like the lock and key mechanism isn't working. And because of that, it's not opening up that glucose channel. And so glucose can't actually get into the cell. And so instead, we see that glucose is just floating in the bloodstream, which is why if maybe you used a glucometer and like tested your finger, your blood glucose would be high because the glucose isn't actually in the cells. It's still in the blood. It hasn't made its way in. And so I like to think of this, and we'll come back to this analogy a lot, why insulin resistance happens. But if our body is constantly being flooded with glucose, over and over and over again, I like to think of it as the analogy like the little boy who cried wolf, or maybe a better analogy is if you have kids, um, on the left-hand side, when the kid's like, hey mom, and you're like, yeah, what's up, right? Like they like call and response, right? But if you have a kid, they're like, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, right? You become resistant to that. Like, and so I feel like in the body, it's kind of the same thing. When we're constantly flooded with glucose over and over and over and over again, the cells, those insulin receptors become resistant to wanting to even open up and let glucose come into the cell. I'm like the queen of being able to like tune out a child who's talking like that too much. I'm like, I don't hear anything. um, so let's just say, for example, right, like if we are getting like, if we are insulin resistant, we may eat a meal that has carbohydrates in it. We've chewed up those carbs. We've swallowed those carbs. They came down to our small intestine. They were broken into glucose, right? The pancreas releases insulin, like, hey, we've got high glucose in here. We need to get it back into this level, but the cells are resistant. So they're not opening up and they're not letting that glucose come in. And so instead, we can see that the blood glucose is, or the glucose is staying in the blood and it didn't go to the cell. So this cell right here, it looks kind of like deflated, like it didn't get the energy that it needed. And so that, like I said, that glucose stayed in the blood. Your blood sugar may be high because it didn't go into the cells because they were resistant. And because the cells didn't get the fuel that they need, they didn't get the energy that they need, they didn't get fed, right? Like their needs weren't met. And that can make us feel like our needs weren't met. So even though we ate a meal, we still might feel depleted and exhausted, maybe even hungry again, even when we just ate, because our cells aren't fueled, right? We have billions of cells inside of us, so we need to feed them. And so if they're not able to utilize the food, if their energy can't get into the cells, then we're still going to feel tired and run down and exhausted, even if we just consumed a meal. And so remembering that the body wants this Goldilocks effect, right? If the body is sensing that the blood glucose is too high, it's going to try to bring it down. It wants it to be in that normal range, right? The body is always trying to keep us in balance. It always wants to have us in homeostasis. It's always like, I want you just right. And so it'll do a couple things. It will store some in the liver, and then it will store some in the muscles. And but there's only so much storage space. There's like only so many like suitcases it can like push glucose into. Like, okay, there's too much in the blood. If we're going to put some here in the liver, we're going to put some in the muscles, right? But then when it runs out of storage space, the body is so smart. And what the body will do is it's like, all right, fine. I'm going to take all of that extra glucose in the blood and I'm going to package it all up together. And what it makes is triglycerides. So this is why sometimes it goes hand in hand when somebody who is diagnosed with diabetes, they'll often look at triglycerides. They'll look at a lot of like your cholesterol and liver numbers too, because like I said, so it'll package up glucose molecules, make it triglycerides, and triglycerides are stored as fat. And so this is something common too, right? People who are like type 2 diabetic and they're like, I have this stomach, like abdominal fat that I cannot get rid of, right? It typically will kind of lay there right on the belly. And so we just have to know, right, when we have a lot of carbohydrates, when it breaks down into a lot of glucose, when that glucose can't go in, like when it's resistant, not going to the cells, the liver's full, the muscles are full, then the body's like, we can't have you free floating out here, okay? You're going to have to get packaged up and go somewhere else. And that's exactly what the body does. And like I said, it packages up as fat cells to be like used at a later date. But like you ain't got to go home, but you can't be here right now. So, what are, I guess, what are some causes, right? Like, why is insulin resistance even happening? Especially when we're like, it's doubling in the past 30 years, like what's going on? And so I like to show, or maybe I like to explain, right? A lot of times diabetes type 2 is referred to being a modern lifestyle disease. And it's actually really interesting because there's like a Dr. Weston A. Price in like the 30s, and there's been a couple of doctors who have studied this. But when people who eat their traditional like hunters and gatherers, berries, nuts, and seeds, they were like fishing out there, like doing their hunt and gather business, whatever, like farming, like just eating foods like naturally from the earth, really no chronic illness, right? And so what they study though is as soon as these cultures got introduced to what we call like the standard American diet, so like a lot of refined foods, a lot of like sugar and like white bread, as soon as cultures got introduced to food like this, suddenly these numbers started to increase, right? So suddenly numbers of obesity and heart disease and diabetes, as soon as we started introducing food that was like processed and like I said, things that were more refined. And so, right, so some of the causes are going to be obesity, lack of exercise, so like a sedentary lifestyle, and then some diet choices. But also to me, this is where I'm also like, okay, once again, if this is more of like a modern disease, then this is where I try to almost like, how can, like, I'm like, I'm not going to go back and be a hunter-gatherer, right? Like, I got some processed stuff in my kitchen, like, we drive to the store, whatever. But how can I maybe mimic a little bit of like how my grandparents used to live or my great grandparents before all of this chronic illness set in? And so let's talk about some things that we can change and some action steps forward based on, right, like we said, like that sedentary lifestyle, the obesity, and then like the diet piece of it. So some action steps forward. So just naturally as humans, right? Like we do live more sedentary lifestyles. Like now we can work from home, we can sit on our desks. Like if we go to work, we like just sit in our car. We're like in the same form all day. We like get out of our car, we go like sit at our office desk, get back in our car, right? And then we come home and watch Netflix. No shame. It's just what it is to be a modern human now, right? We have a lot of conveniences. I got a Roomba that sweeps my floor for me. I don't even have to sweep my floor anymore. But because of this sedentary lifestyle, because of this lack of movement, right? We talk about our ancestors, like they had to be out in the garden. They had to be out there like washing stuff on a washboard, hanging up clothes, chasing chickens around. Like they were just moving, right? Because we now live a more sedentary lifestyle, what obesity can do, and I should say specific, like this isn't about body size or body shape by any stretch of the imagination. But what we're talking about specifically is that fat cells, adipose tissue cells, are their own endocrine organ. And so they're able to send out chemical messengers. And what's really interesting is that fat cells can send out what are called adipokines. And when those go to cells, they can tell cells to be less sensitive to insulin. And so if we think about it, right? So if we have adipose tissue, if we have those like fat cells in our body, right? And they're telling cells to be less resistant or less sensitive to insulin. When glucose comes into the body and insulin comes knocking at the cell, like, hello, hello, let glucose in, and the cells aren't sensitive to it, then we have more glucose in the blood. And remember, the blood's like, or the body's like, we can't have this much in the blood. We need to store that as more fat tissue. We need to store that up and put that somewhere else because it can't be here. So it's kind of like this carousel ride that we're on. It's like it's storing it as more fat cells, but fat cells are telling our cells to be less sensitive. And so it's like I said, we're kind of on this like loop. And so some action steps that we can take, right, to get out of this are going to be some gentle, right? Like I always talk, I'm like, listen, like I'm not here. Listen, if you're here for like Orange Theory and hit like that can be your jam, totally go for it. But like we live 30 minutes from a gym. I don't want to pay $150 a month to go to any of those places. The lighting, it stresses me out, whatever, it's weird. If that's your thing, go for it though. But I'm like, it doesn't have to be um like really strenuous exercise, or you don't have to have like a personal trainer. But I just like I'm like I keep let's see, I have like a kettlebell at the end of my bed, and I get up in the morning and I just do like 10 minutes. And you can find like a YouTube or like a 10-minute circuit. And maybe it's just some squats and just like some movement of the arms. I don't even know what these things are called. I just follow what the lady tells me to do, right? You can get a resistance band and do some of that. When I used to work in nursing in the hospital, like we would have a 30-minute lunch break. And so I would go sit outside and eat for 15 minutes. And then the last 15 minutes, I would like take a couple laps. Um, I would take a couple laps like around the hospital before I went back up onto my shift. Other things that you can do, like calling a friend and being like, can I get, like, you want to join a fitness class, a Zumba, like once or twice a week? You know what I mean? And like making it fun. And so even like I watched that Blue Zone documentary on Netflix, and I feel like they highlighted this really well. So I mean, like just like a small tangent, right? They were following people who like were like 100 years old who didn't have any chronic illness. And they're like, what do y'all do in your day-to-day life, right? None of these old people in Italy or like Costa Rica were going to hit classes or whatever. They were just like walking a lot, right? Or they were like moving their bodies, still squatting, getting up and down from the floor. But, and we also know when we put on muscle mass, and it doesn't have to be like bulked out muscles, just like muscle in general, right? When we move our bodies, when we put on muscle, it helps to burn that adipose tissue that we were just talking about more efficiently. Um, so that can be really helpful. So like I said, just some like gentle, like 10 minutes on a lunch break, call a friend. You want to join a class? That can be a nice action step forward. Make it fun. Don't make it crazy. So the second piece, right? So we talked about some of the contributing factors, one being obesity. And because of those, the fat cells, the signaling, right? Them telling the cells not to be as sensitive to insulin. But then the other piece that we have to recognize that has changed is that the way that our food is made now is definitely different than 2 or 3 generations ago. Like even within like our grandparents' lifetime, food has definitely changed. And so I want us to think of, and this is where I go back to, I'm like, carbs aren't bad in nature, right? So if we look at this top thing, complex carbohydrates, right? These are foods that you would probably see, like you're like, oh, like if I saw this like potato growing, I know what it is. If I saw these fruits growing, I know what they are, right? But complex carbs are foods in their whole form. And so they contain fiber, they contain vitamins, they contain like polyphenols, they have all of these really incredible things for our body. Like that's just how they were divinely created and given to us. And so I'm like, that's how we were supposed to eat them. The problem becomes when we have, as science has like learned to refine a lot of our food for convenience, or we refine food so it's more shelf stable, or refine food so it like looks more palatable, or We put like really pretty colors on it, right? But when we refine food, what we're doing to it is we're taking the fiber out, we're taking out a lot of the vitamins, and what we're just leaving, like if you look at this example on the right of a grain, a whole grain has carbohydrates in the middle in the endosperm, but then it also has vitamins. And then if you look on the outside in the bran, it's got fiber in it, right? So historically, we would have taken that whole grain and ground it up, and that's how we would have made wheat for our bread. But now, when we refine things, we're only using the white piece in the middle that only has those carbohydrates. And so, what fiber does, though, is when we consume fiber, when it's in our small intestine, when it's in our gut, it actually slows the transit time. And so, this is important because if it's coming through a gut at like a slower, more steady pace, then when we went back to the beginning, that like Lego stack, I want you to think of like one glucose molecule kind of popping off at a time and another glucose molecule popping off at a time, right? It's like the fiber has slowed it down. And so the glucose is really slow and steadily entering the bloodstream. The body's like, okay, like we know what to do with this, right? Like it's kind of preparing and getting ready and releasing insulin like at a nice pace. What happens if we don't have a lot of fiber, right? So if we refine a lot of our foods, if we strip them of all of the fiber, and then like not only did we refine them and take the fiber out, but then we added in a ton of sugar, right? Which is just glucose, like just plain old glucose molecules, right? When we did that, that's like a glucose bomb going off in the stomach, right? So then like in that case, maybe you could think of like a bag of Legos, like in their individual pieces, if we go back to that beginning analogy, just getting like dropped in the stomach, like whoop, figure it out, right? And so the body has got this like really quick hit and this really big um, spike all at once. And so, like I said, when I'm like thinking about carbs and people are like, a carb is a carb. And I'm like, no, it's not, right? Because 10 grams of a carb in broccoli is way different than 10 grams of a carb in like a donut, just because of that, because of the fiber component and because of all of the other nutrients and stuff that food in its whole form contains. But why that's important is when we go back to, right, like, I guess I should go back, right? When we go back to like, when cells are becoming resistant, I want you to look at that bottom picture, right? So if we get that bomb that goes off in the stomach, right? Like that bomb of blood sugar, right? And we talked about the cells being like, hi mom, hi mom, hi mom, hi mom, right? All of the time, like knock, 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 knock. The cells are getting tired. And the cells are like, I'm not like they're becoming resistant because we're knocking too often, right? And so the cells, like I said, they're not responding to that insulin that was released. And so in our early teens, possibly our early 20s, we could eat a lot of this food in the bottom left and it wouldn't affect us and we were fine, right? And the body like adapted and tried and released insulin and did what it needed to do, right? But as we come into our later 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Getting through our menopausal years, our body's like, right? Like it's just, it can't respond the same. And so, like I said, it becomes resistant and it doesn't open up when the insulin comes knocking to let the glucose in. And so when we're thinking of, right, this like blood sugar roller coaster, and I want to go back and say, like, I feel like this is, I feel like we were bamboozled. I don't know how else to put it. I feel like maybe we have been, I don't want to say like we've been lied to with our food choices, right? Because we go into the grocery store and like I was at like this is how I grew up. I grew up on Kid Cuisine and Hot Pockets and Pop Tarts and Eggos, right? I grew up on all the fun stuff and like it's got all the fun like Disney characters on it and you would trade with your friends and it was quick and it's easy and it's convenient and like that was marketed to us as like, well, if it's in the grocery store, it's food and it's healthy and it's fine, right? And so this one I'm like, we've been lied to. Like we have been, like I said, somebody pulled the hood over on us because that's just, I mean, because really it's like those companies have food scientists and things to make people come back again and again and again and again, right? And so this is where I'm like, it's not like I'm like, this is not anybody, it's not our fault as individuals if we didn't learn this stuff, right? Especially like this is the food that my parents fed me, right? Like they didn't know any different. They're like, it was in the store. This is what we gave you, right? And so I'm like, it's not our fault as individuals if now we're like, what in the heck is going on? Why is my body responding this way? And it's because we aren't living how we, like I said, how we ancestrally used to. We're not living with those like natural things in our body. And because of that, like the body's like, I don't know what to do with this much glucose in here. This is too much for me. Anyways, I digress. Um, so when we get on this blood sugar roller coaster, so let's say we start at the beginning and right, the standard American breakfast might be like, mine used to be like mini muffins or Pop-Tarts before I went to work, right? And so what happens is we consume that like refined carbohydrate. It's probably like Pop-Tarts, it's probably like all white flour, and then they add a ton of sugar to it. We consume that, we eat those carbohydrates, right? That breaks down into glucose super quickly. There's no fiber in there. Like I said, it's just like a glucose bomb in the stomach, and our blood sugar immediately spikes. And the body's like, what just happened? Right? And so the body sends a lot of insulin in. It's like, we have to get this into the cells. We need to get this stored somewhere. And immediately our blood sugar tanks because the body tries to store it super quickly. It's like, we can't have this much in here. And so you might feel like I had a muffin, I had a bagel, I had a Pop-Tart, I went to work, and an hour and a half later, like I was tanked out. Like this is how I used to feel. I would be like, oh my gosh, I'm like, I just ate, like I'm exhausted, I've got cravings, I'm hangry. And typically what we're going to reach for when we get our blood sugar crash is like our body intuitively wants to pull us up really quickly. So it's like going to reach for sugary things. It's going to reach for those like it's like an orange juice or like gummies or a muffin or something to try to pull our energy back up again. And so we're like, so you might have a sugary coffee drink right after to try to pull yourself up. And then the insulin's like, no, 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 this is way too much. And then shuttles us back down super quickly. So this can feel exhausting for the body, and this can feel like a stressor. And you may have felt this way. You may have had days where this and you're like, I am hangry, I've got mood swings, I feel irritable, like I feel like I need sugar, I'm craving sugar, my energy's dropping. And at the bottom of it, like man, like I feel low. Like I just like you get home and you're like, I should crawl in bed. Like I feel like I got run over today. Right. So like how does this unbalanced blood sugar make us feel? Right. We can feel, like I said, we can feel irritable, hangry, dizzy, right? If I'm hungry, like get out of my way, right? Like fatigued, sweating, palpitations. We can feel shaky. It can make us feel nauseous and brain fog. Remember, we talked about how the brain needs a steady state of glucose, nice and even. And so if we're going up and down like this all day, the brain, like that can be really troubling to the brain. And then it can also lead to some things like hormone imbalance as well. Um, I just threw this in here really quick because I used to get this all the time at the hospital. People would be like, what if I just leave this on? Like, how important is this, right? And have patients like an A1C of like 20, right? And they'd be like, does this matter? And yes, it does matter. And why it matters is because when we have a lot of sugar, first of all, it just feels crummy to be doing this up and down yo-yo all day. But when we become resistant to blood sugar and it's hanging out in our blood vessels for too long, what it can do is it can start to damage the inside of the blood vessels. And so you may have heard of like microvascular damage, right? So micro meaning small, small vascular, small blood vessel damage. So like diabetic retinopathy, this is typically why if you're diabetic, you have to get eye exams every year just to make sure your vision isn't getting worse, right? Like we want to make sure we're not damaging the blood vessels of the eye. Kidney damage can happen, right? Potentially needing dialysis long term if we let it go unchecked. Neuropathy, so nerve damage, it damages the small blood vessels that go up to the nerves. And so this can feel like tingling in the feet or like pins and needle feeling. And then like diabetic foot ulcer, so you might have to get foot checks every year as well, right? Because there can be some like ulcerations down there. Sometimes if we like lose the sensation in our feet, we can get an infection down there and then it can like go necrotic and then potentially even amputations, right? So I used to work with a lot of patients who had been diabetic for like I said, 15, 20 years and just like totally let it go unchecked. Um, and then did have like double amputations, right? And so I just feel like it's really important to be like, I don't want like, let's live a life of like vitality and wellness, right? Like put that to the side. And then some other bigger complications, right? Obviously, you're going to be like not microvascular, but macrovascular. So if we damage the inside of the blood cells too often, then cholesterol will come along and try to like patch up those damaged areas. So cholesterol, like at its core, isn't bad, but what cholesterol is trying to do is to repair the vascular damage. And so if cholesterol builds up though, right, that's when we can look at things like stroke and heart attack. So that's why it's really important. I'm like, let's get this, like, let's nip it in the butt while we can. Let's keep this blood sugar balanced, right? Like, let's stay in that nice little Goldilocks level. So yes, it's a BFD. So a quick recap, right? So our modern lifestyles have definitely changed. We're more sedentary. We have access to more processed food that contains higher sugar and lower fiber to slow down that glucose release into the body, into the blood. And then things like obesity and lack of exercise and processed food contribute to sugar dysregulation that can lead to insulin resistance, right? So, like, the cells keep getting this message over and over again, and they're like, I'm not listening. I'm not opening up for the glucose to come in, right? And so we either need to release more insulin or it stores it as fat cells and shuttles it away. But like I said, if that means it's caused by some of this lifestyle stuff, right? Like autoimmune or type 1 is definitely autoimmune in nature, but type 2, right? If it's caused by lifestyle stuff, then we can change it for the better with lifestyle as well. So, how do we get off this blood sugar roller coaster and get the body to feel just right and have this Goldilocks effect again? Um, just like I'm gonna bring it home on the roller coaster analogy, right? So the first one, right, they talk about like all this processed stuff coming up and down, crashing all day. We get off of it and we're like, that was exhausting. And I'll tell you the bottom one, right? Like eating whole foods. And we're going to talk about how to put some meals together, but just trying to keep the body, like I said, like the body kind of likes, I don't want to say like boring, but like mundane. The body doesn't want to do these drastic up and down things that can be inflammatory to the body. So as much as possible, we're trying to keep the body just like nice and subtle, right in the middle. Um, so understanding how different types of food affect our body and blood sugar. So we can see, like the very left is carbohydrates, right? We talked about we chew those up, we swallow them, they break down into glucose very quickly. Um, Not a bad thing. Our cells need glucose for cellular energy, right? But we just want to be mindful of how we're getting those carbs into our body. And then we have things like protein and fat, and we can kind of see it looks like this like bell curve in protein. It's like, okay, some of that turns into glucose. It spikes a little bit later and then it comes down a little bit smoother. And then we see fat, it's like hardly any turns into glucose, and it's just really like a nice little plateau. But I kind of like I feel like this also kind of looks like that roller coaster also, right? And it's like carbs go up really quickly and come down, and then the protein's kind of in the middle, and then fat's like balance and really keeps us satiated long term, but we don't get really that cellular energy that we would have needed. So we need to pair these all together and have this nice overlapping effect when we're consuming a meal. So the body does get the carbs that it needs, but we also want to feel satiated and we want to have it be like this long kind of plateau effect so the body's not like up and down and riding high. So first and foremost, right, some action steps are going to be starting with food. Um, I heard this from a doc and I really love it. And he said, I always tell people to be cognizant of carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And so, cognizant of carbohydrates, right? So, we want to be cognizant. We want to be thinking, like, okay, carbohydrate, this is where I'm like, a carbohydrate of broccoli and a carbohydrate of a donut are not the same, right? So, we want to be cognizant of where we're getting our carbohydrates from. Would my grandmother recognize what that food is? If it's something packaged and we bring it home, could I recreate this in my kitchen? Um, and then I like to say no naked carbs, especially if we're having difficulty regulating our blood sugar. And why this is, if we just eat naked carbs by themselves, right? No protein, no fat to blunt the effect, then we're going to be on that roller coaster ride. So if we're going to have carbohydrates, even if it's something healthy like an apple, right? We want to make sure that we're like pairing that with maybe some high protein yogurt or some like nut butter or something just to, like I said, help our body slow down the process so it's not like that glucose bomb that went off in the intestine. And then we want to prioritize protein, right? Because if we go back to this picture, we can see protein, it's going to peak at like 2 to 4 hours. It's going to be like a more blunted effect, and it's also going to keep us satiated longer. And then not to fear fats. I feel like a lot of times we hear like we think like it's actually interesting in different languages or different cultures, the word fat, like dietary, like fat that we eat and like abdominal fat are not the same word. And I think that we get tripped up because in our English language, we think like if I eat fat, I'm going to get fat. And that's really just not true. So I'm like, don't fear fats. Like use cooking fats, use olive oil, coconut oil, butter, ghee, animal fat, right? Like things, once again, in their whole form. Um, and like don't be scared of those. And that's going to give us a nice blunted effect too. So prioritize proteins, right? People are like, sometimes they're like, I don't even know what protein looks like. So we can, of course, think of like our animal proteins. So fish, chicken, beef, steak, beef and steak are the same thing. Um, like Greek yogurt, there's like a high protein Greek yogurt. We can think of vegan and vegetarian sources. So like cannellini beans and tempeh and tofu, black beans, quinoa. And when I think of protein, I like clients that I work with, I typically tell them like getting a palm size of protein with every meal. And people are like, "What?" And I'm like, "I know, right?" Because my my youth, I used to just eat like a bowl of cereal, right? There's no protein in that. And so I'm like, yes, a palm size of protein with every meal. I don't weigh my stuff. I don't really like numbers, but I'm like, if you need numbers, like 30 grams of protein with every meal. But like for me, a palm size works. And so if it's like a palm size of beans, or like I said, tofu or chicken, fish, yogurt with every meal, right? And then if we're eating snacks, making sure we're getting like some high protein in our snacks too can be really supportive and really helpful for our blood sugar. We want to stay satiated and full longer and have that nice slow release of glucose in the body. Um, some people are like, I don't like to cook. And I'm like, I don't really like to cook either. I mean, I do like to cook now, but I'm like, I like to be like I'm like an easy cooker. Like I'm not trying to be like stirring stuff all day on the stove top. So I like to do things like roasted. I tell people who are like really busy or they have kids or they're coming home, I'm like, listen, if you get home at 5, you can make a sheet pan meal. So you can put a piece of chicken or a fish, that's your protein on there. Um, and then you can put some of those complex carbohydrates in there that have those fibers. Put some olive oil, some salt and pepper, and like roast that in the oven, right? You can do crock pot meals. We do a lot of quiche in our house. That way we just have like something for breakfast every day and we don't have to think about it. Meal prepping, like that middle one is like tofu with edamame and some carrots. And you can have that like stacked in your freezer and kind of easy to pull out and ready to go. But then that way you have a nice balanced meal, like I said, of some protein, of some fat, everything on this plate you recognize. Your grandmother would be like, I know exactly what that is. You know what I mean? The second thing that we really want to be mindful that's going to help support our blood sugar is at making sure we're getting adequate fiber. So we talked about that, right? Like a lot of foods now, they're very refined. They pull the fiber out of food, right? It's like I feel like kids are like, I don't like brown bread. I only want white bread. And I'm like, eat the brown bread, you know? But we want to make sure we're getting a lot of fiber in our food. So we can do this in a whole foods way or food is medicine way. We can do this by eating things like pears and apples with the skin on and potatoes with the skin on and almonds and lentils and chia seeds, right? Like we can get fiber in that way. We say to aim for about like 25 grams of fiber per day, right? We talked about fiber is going to slow how quickly the meal is coming through the small intestine, which means it's going to slow how quickly glucose gets released up into the blood. That way, the body has this nice kind of steady stream, and it's not like a big glucose bomb going off in the body. And so we can see that, right? It's good for colon health, it's good for constipation, it keeps us full longer to eat fiber, lowers blood cholesterol, and improves our blood sugar. But if you're like, okay, there's no way I'm going to get that much fiber in, and as a food is medicine way, right? There are things like these Flora bars have like 13 grams of fiber in them. So sometimes I'll have those in the morning. You can get other, like if you get other fiber bars at the store, I would just be mindful, like when you flip it around, make sure they don't have a lot of added sugar in there because sometimes they taste chalky. And so in order to make them not taste like chalk, they'll put like chocolate chips and like sugar and honey in them. So just be mindful, right? Like because that's a refined carbohydrate, that's refined sugar, right? And that's going to be like a glucose bomb going off in the stomach. So we want to be mindful of that. But we can also do things like fiber supplements. Um, and that can be something just short term, right? Until you're like, no, like until you're like adding in a lot of different fruits and veggies. Or some people are like, I'm just never gonna get that much fiber and I want a fiber supplement, right? So we can do something like that too. And that's like I said, that's going to help us slow that that glucose quick hit. It's going to make it a little bit more blunted when we add some fiber into our bodies. Some other things that can be helpful initially. So, like I said, like I don't really love low carb or like food restriction because once again, I'm like carbohydrates to me are fuel for cells. And carbohydrates are, especially things that are natural, I'm like, these were divinely given to us. And I don't like to restrict things that I feel like are natural and given to me, right? By Creator, thank you so much for these beautiful carrots and potatoes and everything else. But if your blood sugar has been dysregulated for a while, and you feel like I'm doing these things, I'm adding in protein, like, but my numbers are still really high, like I need like an extra little pep in my step to let my body come back into balance, right? Some people find it really helpful to lower their carbohydrate intake. And so we have what's like the standard American diet, right? That's about like around 300 grams of carbs a day. And then we can see we can go low carb, and that's between like 150 to like 130. And then people sometimes will even push and go into ketogenic, and that's down to 50 grams, less than 50 grams of carbs a day. And so when we think about when we eat carbohydrates, they break down into glucose. When those glucose molecules come into our bloodstream, and that tells insulin, you got to knock, knock, knock at the door to let the glucose come into the cells, right? The cells are resistant. They're not listening to insulin. And so we have this extra glucose free floating in the blood. So lowering how much free floating glucose we put into the blood can give the body enough of a break and enough rest, right, in order to repair until the body becomes resensitized to insulin again. And so, right, that same analogy of like, mom, right? And we're like, you're like shut off from it. I'm resistant to it. I'm not listening to it. And if we keep flooding our body, even if it's good carbs, even if it's things like I said, fruit and veggies, right? The body's still like, I'm resistant to this, right? If we step back and we stop hearing that mom all the time, and we get a break from it, and then it gets reintroduced and it's slower, right? And we allow the body some time and space to rest and heal, that can be really beneficial. Like I said, not something that people have to do long term, but I do hear from some people who are like, okay, I tried all of the things. I tried putting on muscle and I walked after my meals and I prioritized protein and I included fiber and my numbers still weren't really budging and I just needed some training wheels or some support. And so doing something, like I said, lowering carbohydrates temporarily, not taking them out completely, just lowering them can sometimes give the body enough rest in order, like I said, to get some healing back in there. Um, this is just another picture for people who are like, what carbs would I eat then? And so the ones at the top, right? So these don't have a lot of carbohydrates in them. So things like lettuces and mushrooms, cauliflower, broccoli, right? Like all like eggplant, right? Like go for it. Make hashes with those. Enjoy yourself, right? And then we see the ones at the bottom, things like tubers and potatoes, sweet potatoes, some squashes, right? We can see have higher carbs in them. And so it's like maybe not like avoiding them altogether, but just being mindful that a carb, when it breaks down into glucose, it's still going to spike the blood sugar. So just being mindful of like which carbs we're choosing. So this is just some specific foods that we can add in that have been like studied for their blood sugar properties. And so we hear a lot about berries, especially blueberries. I feel like everywhere I turn, I hear something about blueberries and like their magnificent qualities. But berries, especially those really dark pigment-rich berries, have anthocyanins in them. And so that can help protect those blood vessels, those like microvascular blood vessels, right? So things like in retinopathy, when we're talking about like the eye damage or the kidney damage, berries with their antioxidant properties can be supportive. Things like onions and garlic have been studied for their ability to support insulin binding sites. We see things like legumes in the legume family. This is going to be herbs and food. We'll talk about some legume herbs on the next slide. But things like green beans, string beans, wax beans, they have a property or a constituent called inositol. like I said, you don't have to remember this stuff at all, right? This is just, we're just eating whole foods. But they have something called inositol, which can increase insulin sensitivity. Mushrooms help to modulate our immune response and inflammation. So blood sugar dysregulation up and down like this can be inflammatory. So consuming and adding in some things like that, like I said, that help modulate the immune response can be helpful. And then just like things in our spice cabinet. So cinnamon, fenugreek, ginger, turmeric, black pepper have all been studied for being like anti-inflammatory and also being supportive of blood sugar as well. And then there's some research on apple cider vinegar for decreasing fasting glucose levels. So like I am definitely in the camp of I like to do things food as medicine as much as possible. I like to say on like supplements, I feel like can be training wheels if we need them, but I feel like when we get back to the basics, back to how we used to live, right? Like that's when our health was the best. That's when we had the most vitality. So that's why I'm like, I like to, like I said, I like to encourage food as medicine. So some ways that we could do this, right? We could put berries on oatmeal with that cinnamon, right? And nut butter. We could make an art like an onion, garlic, um, green bean and mushroom hash or stir fry or fried rice. We could do something like a golden milk latte, which is like your milk of choice, so oat milk, regular milk, whatever, and then adding in turmeric and ginger and cinnamon, right? And then making a salad dressing with like apple cider vinegar, olive oil, salt, and a dash of pepper and mustard. And then we talked about walking and how important it is to put on muscle, but also walking after meals can be so beneficial. And why that is because we talked about, okay, so the muscles, every time we move our muscles and we do anything, they require glucose. They need to pull in glucose for their fuel, for their energy. And so if we consume a meal and we have glucose free floating in the body, if we take a walk afterwards, a nice, just kind of like light, brisk walk afterwards, the muscles have to work. And if the muscles have to work, the muscles need fuel. And if the muscles need fuel, they're going to pull glucose out of the blood into them. So that can also help to blunt our effect of glucose as well. So we can kind of see this top one, right? Like sitting after a meal, blood sugar spikes. We can see at the bottom, if we walk, it's going to be that nice kind of like middle range. And like I said, we're always kind of shooting for that Goldilocks effect, that in the middle, that nice balance. And then some herbal things that we can add in. Um, I always like to sound like we got to do foundations first, right? We got to like walk, we got to put on muscle, we got to prioritize protein, we got to do the food thing, we got to do that stuff first. And then we can add on some herbs to be like the cherries on top and the fun, right? I feel like a lot of times people are like, I feel like because herbal medicine's so big, people are like, tell me the herbs. And they're like, but if we're not going to change our lifestyle, the herbs can only do so much. But I digress. So some herbs that we can use just like the beans that are in the legume family, some herbs in the legume family are astragalus, alfalfa, and licorice. Once again, they contain the inositol compound, which helps with insulin's sensitivity, right? So when insulin comes knocking, the cells are more sensitive to it to allow glucose to come into the cells. Cinnamon, we just talked about, right? Shown in studies to reduce fasting insulin and increase insulin sensitivity. Berberine is often referred to as being like nature's metformin, um, found in things like golden seal and Oregon grape, and studied for lowering blood sugar, cholesterol, and blood pressure. And I just want to talk about so like nature's metformin, and this is why I really like herbal medicine, is because a lot of our pharmaceutical medications came from plants, right? Like plants were our first allies. We have evolved alongside plants from the beginning of the time. Plants used to be the only medicine that we had until science came along, but science didn't get this stuff from thin air. Science is like, why is that plant working? Why are they getting better when they're eating that plant? Why is that helpful, right? And then what science does is they come along and they like extract the one compound out of a plant and they make it more potent, and then we can sell it as a pharmaceutical. And in a like in emergent situations, I'm like totally needed. Absolutely. Like we definitely need pharmaceuticals for sure. But I feel like when we look at the pharmaceuticals, like that's not how, like plants have this synergistic effect. I feel like they're more gentle and they're more well received by the body, where pharmaceuticals can kind of come in gangbusters sometimes. Um, but I do just think it's interesting that when we take pharmaceuticals, we're like, yeah, sure, even though the side effect list is like this, right? We were watching TV last night and it's like, it may cause da 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 da, right? With plants, we really don't get that as much. So just being right, being maybe bringing in some herbal friends. But some other ones. Bitter melon is used in traditional Chinese medicine for lowering fasting glucose and increasing insulin sensitivity. Green tea for fasting glucose and A1C. I want to say this in my head all the time is Gymenia, but that's not how you pronounce it. And I'm not going to butcher it because I'm not sure. But it's also shown to have anti-obesity, anti-diabetic properties, and to decrease blood pressure, insulin, glucose, and lipid levels. So like we said, some of these, like astragalus, you can get in powder and you can mix that into your oatmeal. Cinnamon, you can make into your oatmeal or into a golden milk latte. Some of these you can find in capsule form, like the berberine on the bottom right. You can find some in tincture form. Um, Things like licorice root you could get in tea, right? Like, so it's kind of like, how am I going to drink stuff in tea? Do I just want something in a capsule? The products on the left are by an herbalist. Her name's Organic Olivia. She has a podcast, but she also has a line of stuff focused on metabolic health and blood sugar regulation. And then some of these contain, like I said, like that Gymenia and bitter melon and licorice root. And she kind of like has already made a blend in there. So you could try something like this, right? You could do all the foundational stuff. And if herbal medicine kind of resonates with you, you could add this on and just see how it feels in your body, right? And then of course I have to say, like, as always, if you're on prescription medications, discuss with your doctor. I will say if you go to your doctor and you ask them about licorice root, they're probably just going to be like, no, because they're just not taught that in their training. It's not a knock to them. It's just not taught in the medical school. But like I said, I just find it interesting that doctors are like, we'll prescribe this big stuff, but like herbal stuff, lavender, so you'll have to, like, this is when it becomes, working with an herbalist, somebody in functional medicine, a naturopath, or just deciding for yourself, maybe looking up some of these products and being like, does this resonate with me? Does this feel like something that feels supportive to my body? Um, and then just noticing how your body feels if you do decide to bring in um, an herbal ally. So to recap, action steps for getting us in that just right effect. We want to prioritize protein, not fear fat, and be cognizant of carbs, right? Maybe we need to lower carbs for a bit. Depends on how our body's responding. We'll talk about that next. We're going to opt for foods in their whole forms as much as possible, right? Because in their whole forms, it contains the fibers and the nutrients to blunt the blood sugar effect. No naked carbs. We don't want to have any refined carbs. And then shooting for like 24-ish grams of fiber per day. Maybe walking after meals just to get that glucose into the muscles and out of the blood can be really supportive. Putting on more muscle mass, right? Like more muscle means that glucose has more places to go to be stored, and muscle's going to burn those fat cells more efficiently. And then we can also add in some herbal allies if that's your jam. It's totally my jam. It's not everybody's jam. That's okay. So last but not least, how do I know if what I'm doing is working? So there's a couple of things, right? So some people may feel like more intuitively, like let's say if you're having blood sugar crashes all the time, you're like, I feel swamped, I feel like low, I'm hangry. And then you start to implement some of these things, and all of a sudden you're like, I have more vitality and I have more energy and I have less brain fog. Um, what you're doing is working. Like I would say that would be very intuitive. Some people are like, I want to see, like, I like to see numbers. And so we can monitor our progress a couple of different ways. So I always think that it is, I don't want to say fun, but I can't think of a verb or a word that I want to use, but I always think that, like, it can be nice before we start making changes to get a baseline beat on what's going on. And so what I mean by that, like, before we even start making changes, you could get your A1C run, your fasting glucose, your fasting insulin, your triglycerides, and just see, like, where are we even starting from, right? So that way, when you start to maybe implement some things and make changes, and then you go get it rechecked in a month or two or three, right? And then you see your numbers change. You're like, oh, shoot, that is working, right? Because like I said, some people are like, I don't know if it's working, right? But the numbers aren't going to lie. So if you start to make change and then you go back, and that can also be like a nice little, like, pep in our step, a nice little, like, pat on the back, like, yeah, when we see the numbers, we're like, okay, like, we're doing something. We're like moving in the right direction. Let's keep on trekking, it can be a nice little support. Some other things that we can do, we can keep a food diary and we can write down how we felt when we ate something. So like if I ate a muffin for breakfast, right? And I felt crashed afterwards, like that's your body's kind of like intuitive knowledge. It's what like your body is telling you how it feels. And so we're just tracking and paying attention. But if you're like, I made a hash with some eggs and some green beans, mushrooms, whatever, and I felt really great afterwards and I had like a long stretch of energy, like that's good intuitive knowledge, right? And we can write that down and keep a food diary. So you can either write it or you could get like a phone app and do it that way. Um, some other things that we can do is if you have a glucometer at home, you can get a baseline reading. I guess I'll show you on this page. We could do a baseline reading of your blood sugar. And let's say it's 80. And then you eat what you typically eat for breakfast every morning. Let's say that's a cup of strawberries and a chocolate muffin. And then you use the glucometer and you test again in an hour and it goes up to 220. You test again in 2 hours and it's 210. And then at 3 hours, it drops down to 60, right? And you write those numbers down. That might kind of like show you where your trend is and what that roller coaster picture looks like. And then let's say the next day you're like, okay, like that, and you're like, okay, and I wrote down like I felt hangry and tired and fatigued, like that didn't feel great. And the next day you switch it up and you're like, okay, I have a cup of strawberries and I added some protein yogurt and a hard-boiled egg and some almonds. And then when you go to test your blood sugar at 1 hour, it's 120, at 2 hours, it's 105, and at 3 hours, it's 90. And you felt like, oh, like I felt satiated and I felt like I had energy, right? Like that can be really good information just to try to like track where you're at. Something that I like, and I know that a lot of clients like to use, because with the glucometer, we can feel like we're like, I'm poking my finger so often. Like for some people, they're like, that just is annoying. So what some people like to use is getting one of those like CGMs, continuous glucose monitor on the back of the arm. If you are pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic, I think it's covered by insurance. But there's also some companies I think that like sell them for, I don't know, like maybe 50 bucks a month or something. And you could just use it for a month and it's constantly monitoring your glucose. And so what you can do is, you can be writing down the meals that you ate, and then you're like, you use your phone, you tap the back of your arm, and you look at the information, and it's going to be like your unique roller coaster. It's going to tell you like, oh, like when I ate that, my blood sugar went way up, and then I came back down. But when I did this, and I walked after my meal, and I added in some protein, it was actually kind of like a blunted effect, and my energy lasted longer, right? So that can just be that can give you unique information about your body. Because a lot of times what people will say is like, Hannah, like, how many carbs should I eat? Right. And it's like, it depends. Everybody's different. Your body is unique. Your blood sugar is going to be unique. How your body responds to certain foods is going to be unique. So it does become this learning the conversation and the communication with our body, right? So to me, what health looks like is, like I said, having good vitality, having balanced energy, being able to like get up and do like not feeling crashed. Like that's our body talking to us. And when our body is hangry and irritable and mood swingy, our body's talking to us in a different direction and being like, that ain't it, right? But also, like I said, the numbers can be really, really supportive and helpful as well. And that can give you some information of what's working and what's not working to keep us in that nice Goldilocks, that middle range. And the more that we stay here in this middle range, the more that we keep our body here, right? The more that the body is able to heal, that the body feels safe, that the body feels like, okay, like we can repair some stuff. Um, when the body feels like it can heal and come into balance and have homeostasis, that's when the body's like, okay, like right? We're turning over cells every single day. We're making new cells every single day. And these new cells can then be sensitized to insulin, use it properly, allow the glucose to come in and do its job effectively. So, like I said, like if you feel like this is so new to me, I'm so unsure where to start, right? Working with a practitioner can be really helpful. So like if you have a doctor who is like way on board and very supportive, like working with them to, like I said, order these baseline labs, sit down with you and discuss what's working and what's not working. Some doctors just don't have the time, unfortunately, and that's just not a knock to them. That's just the system that they work in, right? Some of docs are like, we have 15 minutes or less with each patient, right? But if you have a naturopath that works with you, if you have a nutritionist around you, if you have a health coach that you really like, you can always reach out to me. Like, this is what I do, right? But like, if you have somebody in your area, just somebody to be like, yo, like, I don't know where to start. I need some support. Reaching out to somebody that can be like kind of like training, right? But like we don't learn how to ride a bike by ourselves. We need somebody to like hold the bike seat for us for a while. And then when we get it, we're like, okay, I got this, right? Like I'm good to go. I know exactly what my body needs. Like I said, just like examples, if I was sitting down with somebody, like I said, finding somebody that you're like is willing to maybe sit down with you for 60 or 90 minutes and like get those baseline labs. If you have a CGM, look at that data with you. Somebody who's willing to like, let's put some custom food together for you. Like what's working well, what's not working well. Like here's some herbal recommendations. And then checking back in like 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, what went well, what didn't? It's not going to be overnight, right? Like we have to try different things. We got lots of tools in our toolboxes that we can pull out. Um, right? It's a journey. And so I feel like I said this at the beginning, right? But like, why are you here? And so like going forward, if this feels like it's very brand new, or you're feeling like I don't know where to start or where to make change, or like I like to tell people, I'm like, ask yourself why this is important to me. What would balancing my blood sugars do for me? What would decreasing my diabetes symptoms mean for me, right? Um, maybe you're here because you're like, I need more energy. Maybe it's the brain fog thing, maybe crashing, right? Maybe it's an experience with going, like having a scary hospital experience. Like that can be enough for somebody. Like, I don't want to do that again, right? Um, maybe it's financial cost. Maybe it's like, I just want to live like a long life with vitality for my kids, right? But whatever it is, I feel like writing that down and getting really clear on what your why is. And to me, that was one of the most like helpful things because when we know why we're clear on our why, so like for me personally, why I choose to do all of, I feel like probably the crazy things that I do. And I'm like blowing out a huge garden in our backyard and I'm back there tilling stuff until I sweat. Like why that's so important to me though is like, I'm like, I want a life of vitality and wellness. And I want to be in my 80s and 90s and walking around and feeling healthy. And I don't want my daughter to have to take care of me. And I want to be able to like take care of my grandkids, right? On both sides of my family, we have like a lot of heart disease and diabetes, right? And I'm like, I want to get to old age and feel good in my body. That's why it's important to me, right? Like that's why I opt to make choices the way that I do. So anyways, getting really clear on what your why is and why it's important to you, I feel like is one of the biggest um, motivators for steps forward. And then another thing, right, is like I gave you all a lot of information and a lot of action steps. But picking one thing, like, right, maybe some things didn't resonate with you, but maybe like if I said one thing and you're like, ooh, like that hit me, that kind of hit me here for some reason, right? Like that's truth to you. That is your body speaking truth when we hit something, we're like, oh, like that felt whoa, you know? If one of those things hit right, so maybe it's adding in the more protein, maybe it's walking after a meal, maybe it's like, okay, I'm gonna try to cut out some refined carbs, or I'm just gonna monitor, like whatever, pick one and do it for a month and see how it makes you feel in your body, right? And see what begins to change. And then you kind of get like a little like, I don't say I'm not like not addicted, but when you start to feel good, you're like, okay, like what's another thing that I can add in? And how can I go a little bit deeper into this? Um, and I like to always say healing is possible for you, right? And so one of the analogies that I like to give is that like sometimes it can feel really hard, especially if we've had a chronic illness for a while. Like it can feel overwhelming or it can feel like I don't even know where to begin. And I also like I feel like it's very unfortunate that in conventional medicine, we are never taught, like was a nurse, never taught that like we could heal from diabetes. I was never taught that diabetes could be reversed. Some docs would even be like, diet doesn't matter, lifestyle doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter, right? And I like to tell people like, first and foremost, these bodies are made from nature. Like our bodies are natural. They are made with nature. They are divine. And the body always wants to heal. Nature always wants to heal. Because, like, I like to use the analogy if you've seen like a forest fire and it's wiped out an entire area, sometimes that's what chronic illness can feel like. If we come back though in 6 months, it's not still a wiped out area. We start to see these like little green sprouts coming back up, right? We like to like nature's trying to heal itself. It's trying to put vegetation back out there. It's trying to heal the soil, right? It's trying to grow new plants again. It's always trying to come back into balance. It's always trying to bring the body back into homeostasis. It's never too much. It's literally the body's job. It wants us to thrive. It wants us to be alive and well and have vitality, right? Um, we just have to give it the things that it needs, right? So we can't keep coming in with like a fire blaster over and over again because it's never going to heal. But if we're like, let me give it some rest, let me give it that Goldilocks effect, right? Then that good healing starts to happen. And like I said, I feel like by even showing up today and learning something new, right? That's already a step on your healing journey. That's already a step in the right direction, and that can be enough, right? So I'll come off of recording. I want to put my information, like if anybody has any questions or just like if they think of something later, they can contact me. My website's the www.thegutsyherbalist.com. That's what I do. I work one-on-one with clients. I'm always happy if you have questions, like you can always submit them to me. I'm happy to send book recommendations or any nerdy information always and forever. How do I stop recording?